Hey LifePoint students, welcome back to LifePoint Students Online. We are in week 4 of the big story of the Bible, and just great to have another week doing this series. It's really, to me, been very a good reminder of, what are some of the things that maybe God was doing in creation, and what does the fall mean? What is him establishing this covenant, this relationship with a chosen people. And, this story is about all these foundational events in the Bible. And today we're really going to kind of go warp speed through some stuff. And I mean that we're just going to be covering a lot of things like in the Old Testament. And there's a purpose behind that. And actually, this is kind of one lesson, but we're going to kind of have to maybe make a part 2 next week, because there's so much to cover. And again, even going as fast as we're going to go, there's an important reason too, because a lot of this lesson is supposed to lead us up to the purpose and reason God brings us a Messiah. It goes back to our lesson on creation and the fall, because without those events, establishing those, it shows us, yes, we need a Messiah. What happens and why does he come on the scene? And we're going to get to that. And that's kind of why this lesson is so long, because we really want to take the time to understand that there were major events, centuries upon centuries between the events of fall, the creation and fall, all the way to Messiah. Some estimates, could be a millennia. But the point is, and maybe even longer than that, but the point is, really probably much more than that, because by the time we get to Moses, who writes the first 5 books of the Bible, the millennia had already probably passed. So the point is that ultimately, from these events, regardless, there's so much to cover, especially when we're talking about the Old Testament. We want to do some due diligence. We want to really reveal stuff, but not with any too great a detail. And we're going to take a pause in between this lesson from this week to next week and really examine what have we found so far before we get to the Messiah. I guess is all I'm saying, right? So it took a long while to say that, but there it is. One quick thing to kind of mention before anything else, just as a constant reminder, if you're able to watch this on Sunday mornings or sometime Sunday, just remember that we are meeting in person here at the church, 6:30 to 7:30 for now. We might add things later on as they improve, with everything with COVID and everything. That's our hope. That's our hope. That's our goal. I said hope. I don't know why I said that. But that's our hope and our goal, to maybe have more and more elements back into our youth meeting. But just remember, we're here. Have your mask handy. We try to be as socially distant as possible. But again, just as a reminder that you've heard me say it once again, so let's move on. Today's lesson 4, and we're talking about the people of God. And again, with that people of God, we're really talking about the history of those people and their relationship and their interaction with God. I think more specifically today, we're really talking about how Israel was always unfaithful to God, but he was always faithful to Israel. And yes, if we were debating, there were seasons, and by seasons I maybe mean like the reign of this person or the influence of that person on Israel for a time period. Usually it ended with that faithful person's life, and then they moved right back into unfaithfulness. But all in all, you had these small measures of faithfulness and honoring that covenant with butted up against these long periods of unfaithfulness. But the point is that we want to talk about how God still interacted with his chosen people in spite of, or maybe because of, all of that. So, as I pointed out in the opening, we're going to be rolling through a lot of the Old Testament. So we're going to be kind of skipping over a lot of big stories, or at least just kind of mentioning them like real quick. Or we're just, some things might not get any attention at all or any mention at all. And we're not skipping over them. We're not ignoring their importance or their influence. from a spiritual aspect, from a historic aspect. We really just want to kind of hit some highlights that point out this long history of unfaithfulness, and yet how still God interacted, God still worked through that. So again, we don't want to get bogged down on any one particular event or character, but just remember, we recognize that they're there. We want to stick to this main theme that Israel, specifically God's chosen people, has a covenant relation problem with God, but not the other way around. God always keeps his side of the bargain, his side of the covenant. And I think too, what we're kind of calling it is we're kind of calling it Israel's cycle of sin. This constant going back to it all and starting it all over again. And again, times from honoring the covenant to completely going against the covenant. And that, just a reminder, we're talking about that covenant that we mentioned last week with Abraham, that amongst other things, and probably one of the most important things, is that God said, "I will be your God if you be my people." And as long as we keep those, as long as you do your part, letting me be just your God, God alone, the only true God, then you'll be my chosen people, and I'll bless that immensely. So let's kind of start doing some establishing here. So who are some of the patriarchs, some of the forefathers that established Israel as a nation? And that's covering Genesis 12 to 50. So that's a lot of chapters. It starts with Abraham. Talked about him last week. His son was Isaac, who he had around age 100, give or take, right? Isaac, again, pretty simple, followed God very closely like his father. Jacob, who was the son of Isaac, later renamed Israel, because it's also his 12 sons that would become to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. So, if you're wondering where the 12 tribes come from, there it comes from. That brings us to Joseph, who is the second youngest of Jacob's sons. Now, again, we could get into his story, but suffice it to say that this is one of the two sons, the first son, really, that Jacob had with the wife that he really was supposed to continue moving things, the nation of Israel, the nation of Israel with. He had other sons, two other wives that he was kind of forced to have, but that's another topic for another day. Again, don't want to get too deep into it. It's a great Bible study, but not for us today. But again, Joseph, while he was the second youngest, he was the first born of the woman that God had really chosen for Joseph. So, you may remember his brothers shipped him off eventually to Egypt, and there, through a lot of trial and a lot of problems, he became one of the most powerful people there. When famine hit the land, or the massive area called Canaan back in those days, his brothers sought and were granted refuge. Basically, his whole family came to Egypt to live. That nation of Israel would spend about 400 years in Egypt, and at first were very welcomed, but while there grew immensely, not just in size and number of people, but of power and influence. That leads us to the Exodus and the conquest, then when they move back and try to move back into the land of Canaan. A region, again, this is a massive region, which we'll get into. But really, we're talking from books Exodus to Joshua. Again, huge number of books there that we're covering. You may recall, sometime after Joseph's death, 100 years, 200 years, a pharaoh had come to power in Egypt and began to oppress the Israelites, basically because, again, they had grown so large, so strong, and here they live right within our borders. Oh, what if they want to take over one day? Blah, blah, blah. So he begins to oppress and enslave them, make them build things. Moses was a Jew who was raised in Pharaoh's own household, and is eventually later commanded by God to lead Israel, the nation, out of Egypt. and basically their persecution, to the promised land. Sounds familiar, right? You've maybe heard that story before. All very good. God brings plagues on Egypt, forcing Pharaoh to flee Israel. Right? So you remember the plagues. Just an interesting note. If you ever look at the plagues carefully, each plague that God brings actually is a direct assault or a direct reflection of all the various so-called gods in the Egyptian way of belief. Each kind of represents or attacks that representation of who that God is. So God is essentially the true God, Yahweh, our God, is pointing out how false these gods are by attacking them with these plagues that truly represent everything that goes against the pantheon of gods in the Egyptian way of belief. The point is that through these plagues, Pharaoh not only frees the Israelites, he actually gives them all the livestock and gold and silver that they could carry. And that is actually a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 15, 13 through 16. Now this is interesting because, again, prophecy, to be truly prophetic, has to come about. And here we see God fulfilling or continuing to fulfill that promise, again, that covenant that he established some time ago. Obviously, Moses and the Israelites wander in the desert, and they do it for 40 years, basically because they lacked faith. And in that time, God provides water, manna, and quail to sustain them in the desert. He provides all of their needs, and during that time, that lack of faith, they begin to try and get rid of Moses a couple times. They try to have an uprising, God takes care of it. Another uprising, God takes care of it. And so through that time, there's these families. Those families have more children who have families of their own. So God brings out through time, those 40 years, he brings out all those people of unfaithfulness and makes more of a nation of people who are more faithful and willing to follow Moses. So in that time also, Moses makes a covenant with God called the Mosaic Covenant. Again, that covenant is just an agreement between God and his people, the leader of God's people. And God says, if Israel promises to worship God alone, God, will continue to honor the covenant, and that he will give them, hey, here's 10 commandments to follow so that, you continue to worship me and stay faithful to me. Again, should be fairly simple, but, God kind of says it this way in Exodus 19:5. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples for all the earth is mine. So you'll be just like treasured jewel among all the people of the world. So basically, hey, wars, don't worry about them. I got you covered. Financial influence, power, a way to really reveal the world that what happens when I'm your God, and what if you follow me and are faithful. Hey, if you do that, wars are no problem. Wealth is no problem. Peace, really, eventually, is no problem. It can all be achieved if you just be my people and let me just be your God. I think it's a fantastic deal. I don't know, we can sit back and wonder why they missed out on this, but they do. And he's essentially saying that here, as he said it to Abraham, he's saying it once again to Moses. So, eventually, that brings us to this idea or this time period where Joshua then begins the conquest to retake the promised land. Joshua replaces Moses and leads Israel to Canaan. What happens to Moses? Well, essentially, Moses sinned at some point shortly before the 40 years time frame and was forbidden from entering into Canaan. That's in Deuteronomy 32, verses 48 through 52. I highly recommend you read it. Did Moses, of all people, have a moment of disobedience? Yep. If you read it, you'll find it's an interesting situation. And the reason I just take a moment to really point it out is Moses, of all people, through all this time, I would say kept a fairly cool head, considering a lot of the time some Israelites were trying to get rid of him, and he still kind of kept a cool head. In this one instance, he does, in a moment of disobedience, which ultimately is sin, gets punished for it. And it just goes to show you, like, once again, like, someone so faithful, so close to God, who probably is the only physical human being who has seen God in his true person walk by him, that he was that close and was in his presence, still had this moment of human weakness, of failing. And so because of that, he's barred from going into the promised land. Okay, moving on. Israel begins to conquer Canaan through Joshua's military might, military prowess, his good military leadership. And then because of that, and this is, again, we're talking over quite some time, the land is divided among the Israel's 12 tribes, going back to the 12 tribes that we talked about. And again, it's probably worth noting, this idea of conquering Canaan was not as simple as, say, walking into some land area somewhere and saying, oh, this is our home, right? The area they were walking into already was filled with nations. And in those nations there were cities. And in those cities and nations there was armies. So it's kind of a good analogy I share here is that imagine God told us that, we need to take over Europe. That's the land he's giving us, and we just need to take it over and kind of empty it out. Not an easy task, right? So, yet God was calling them to do that and equipping them to do that and making them successful, because now a lot of the people who were doubters, a lot of the people who were often complaining about God's plan and why they even left Egypt to begin with, they're gone now. Even Moses is gone, and now it's a whole new, renewed nation of Israel. That brings us to the time of Judges, and that will take us through Judges chapter 1 through 1 Samuel 9. And the period of Judges in the Bible is a unique kind of time in Israel's history. It basically goes like this. And this kind of coincides, this kind of goes together with that cycle of sin that Israel deals with. And this is, like I said, how it goes. Israel basically does evil in the eyes of the Lord for quite a period of time. And then God delivers Israel into the hands of their enemy because of this evil. And then after some time, they begin to repent. And then, because of that repentance, God brings a judge or a kind of leader, an authority, not quite a king, but certainly a judge who could tell what was right and wrong, judge, and yet still listen and give the people what the Lord was telling them to do. And basically, as long as that judge lived, Israel followed God. Once that judge was gone, right? No more faithfulness. Judges 2:11 says this. And the people of Israel did. And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served Baal. Now Baal was a very common cultic pagan god of many people, but specifically the Philistines. And worship of Baal, a whole lot of human sacrifice, didn't matter necessarily what age that sacrifice kind of took place with, and a lot of impure acts under Baal, right? So we'll just kind of leave it at that. You kind of get my gist. But the point is that get rid of this Baal worship, wipe it from the area, and continue that covenant. Be faithful to me. That was hard for some people to do, believe it or not. Israel demands a king after this time of Judges. We're not going to spend too long on this because we spent a lot of time on Saul, a series back. If you're not familiar with that, go to our YouTube page. Go to our King of Hearts series, where we really focus in on the time of Saul. But that's kind of the time we're entering here. Basically because Israel wanted a king like all the other nations to protect them, They didn't want, essentially, Israel was ultimately rejecting God, Yahweh, as her true king, which is what God had been trying to establish, especially through his covenant. So they were rejecting him. Now, I wrote here, God blesses, but I think more to the point and probably better is God honors this request by Israel for a king. And he basically puts this idea out there that, you know what, I'll go along with this for now, as long as you as the nation of Israel and this king remain faithful and follow me. Saul is the first example of how this is supposed to work. Not a great example, as we established in our last series. Saul is anointed king. He does okay for about 5 minutes and then just totally flubs it up, messes it all up. And because of that, it leads to David's rise to power, who again, even God admits that David is a man after his own heart. But David rises to power during Saul's kingship. David is anointed king. He still tries to continue to serve Saul before Saul's time is up. But Saul goes crazy, tries to kill David, yada, yada, yada. Again, we point that out. And the reason we point that out is yet we see another person who God allows or enables to be in a place of power and influence and totally, again, just messes it up. So David is often considered Israel's greatest king. Some might suggest Solomon because of the era of peace that he brought in, the era of wealth and power and influence, or in the known world at the time, definitely true. But that's kind of also built on the shoulders of David. So, I think another reason that he's considered Israel's greatest king is because, again, he just felt, even God felt he was a man after God's own heart. God made it also part of that same thing, being the greatest king, is that God made a covenant with David in 2 Samuel. And part of that is that David's line would always be on the throne, when there was a throne. And that Messiah, again, part of the covenant, would come from David's family. And that's a prophecy from Jeremiah 33. And that's certainly true. God is establishing, now that he has the man after his own heart in the position of power and influence over Israel, he makes that covenant that through this man, this line, his ancestors, that will come out of that, the person of Messiah. And also, Messiah is often referred to as a king like David or a son of David. So, again, there's a lot of importance put on David for that reason. 2 Samuel 7:16 says this, "And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever." Pretty impressive if you think about it. And then we come to David's son, Solomon. Solomon inherited Israel at its peak, its golden era, and ultimately led Israel into downfall. There's a lot of reason behind that. A lot of the kings that followed Solomon eventually broke the kingdom apart, and we're going to get to that kind of next week. But if it weren't for Solomon having, some say, 700 to 1,000 wives, many of them who worshiped Baal, many of them who brought in pagan practices, bringing that old Baal worship back into the nation of Israel because they never truly eradicated it. I don't want to get too far ahead, but first, let's set up this idea that Solomon had wealth, wisdom, and power. Initially, very faithful to God. He built the temple. David made the plans, but it was Solomon who actually did the work. And the temple importance can't be stressed enough. And the fact that Solomon did it is truly an honor. The temple is where the Ark of the Covenant was housed. The Ark of the Covenant, built under Moses as a physical representation of God's presence among the people of Israel. So holy, it should be kept safe. Before it was a temple, it was called the tabernacle, which is a very impressive and yet still mobile tent that would move. So this temporary structure that had been around for a long time is now replaced by a permanent building in the heart of the nation of Israel, built by Solomon. Huge honor. He also built a palace, and we see that in 1 Kings chapter 7. Solomon was given wisdom by God alone. God asked Solomon, ask of anything and I'll give it to you. Solomon asked for more wisdom. This is kind of like if you could ask for more wishes sort of thing, but not really. He asked for the one thing that probably made him even wiser than anyone. 1 Kings puts it this way, 1 Kings chapter 4:29. The wisdom given to him by God surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. Okay, so both are considered to be some of the most learned places in the world, and yet Solomon had more wisdom than all of them put together. This is reflected by the fact that many people would come to Solomon just for his wisdom from various countries at various times, possibly even pay for that wisdom that they sought. So, through all of this, still Solomon turned from God and worshipped idols. God's promised after this to tear the kingdom from his son, Solomon's sons, leaving only one tribe to him to preserve his promise to David. Again, he'll tear all of that apart, and then, like I said, eventually the nation splits into two kingdoms because of this. Yet, one tribe remains that will still bring out God's promised Messiah and still keep his promise, his covenant with his people. So, this is kind of where we want to pause about right here, because we've warped through so many centuries of events and people, and this is this very fast walkthrough for history. And I said before we want to continue this next week, but there are some important things I think we need to point out that we've kind of not glossed over. In fact, it's been kind of staring us in the face this whole time. And I just want to review this kind of idea that is still there. While the point of much of this series, this lesson, even the Bible, is to point out, like, why does Messiah come? Why is he important? What importance does he hold? To you and I, yes, brings salvation, but what is the purpose of it? You know, what brought that about? And so a lot of this series obviously dwells on that. But there are things that, while not Messiah-related, are still very important for us to reflect on. And that is part of this idea that we see that God chooses these people of faith, like a David and Abraham. Well, Abram and then Abraham. Even Saul, initially, looks like he's full of faith and willingness. And we see Moses, we see God do wonderful, miraculous things through these people. And in all of these cases, a Moses, a Saul, a David, they all stumble into sin somehow, some way. If not sin of various kinds, disobedience, adultery, murder, on and on it goes. And yet, that's part of this idea of Israel's cycle of sin. Solomon especially is guilty of this. This cycle of sin, doesn't really focus on just one person's failures. We see these major figures through this history just talked about, and they certainly have failures, they have sin, they have struggles, but the cycle of sin doesn't just focus on them. Sure, they influenced other people, but it's the unfaithfulness of a whole entire nation. Not just that nation for one instance, but for centuries. We see their unfaithfulness of the whole people. Sure, their leaders influenced a lot of those people, but some people are still doing that unfaithfulness all on their own, choosing to do those sins all on their own. And centuries upon centuries, this nation, who's supposed to be God's chosen people, rebelling essentially against this covenant. And this cycle of sin continues. Oh, sure, they might have a time period where they remain faithful, great, but then they ultimately bring the cycle back around. They start this sin cycle all over again. And I think what this should show us, or encourage us with, more rather, is that God still used these same people. He still used David. He still used Moses, Joshua, Solomon. They all served a purpose at some stage, at some time, despite their imperfections. He still used his nation, his chosen nation, again, despite these struggles that they had, this imperfection that they dealt with. So I think the question I really want to leave with you today as we close is, how patient is God with you and I? Right? In our own struggles, our own times of disobedience, our own times of failure, to keep our end of our relationship. That's not an excuse for us to continue on, not by any stretch of the imagination. But I think the encouragement again here is how willing is God still able or wanting to enable us? How much more still is God willing and wanting to equip us, to empower us, to bring about not only not our needs, but His kingdom, and to be part of that, despite again our own struggles. And I think the absolute answer to all of that, He most certainly desires that, because I think the message here that we see so far in this part of the lesson is that this message that God is not expecting perfection. He's not expecting us to be perfect at all times in this struggle of life here on earth, dealing with the sin nature and rebellion of our own. But He does, and what He looks for is that we have faith that He will use us, faith that He will continue to give us forgiveness. Maybe if we ask for confession, if we ask for redemption, and yes, there's a give and take in our relationship. Well, not so much, but I shouldn't say that. But there's more that idea that we need to communicate with God in our relationship with Him, and to establish that we should know and recognize by now that God isn't looking for that perfection. He wants to maybe help us be more righteous. He wants to help us be more holy in our relationship with Him. But it's really our willingness to be faithful. David wasn't a man after God's own heart because he was perfect. It was because he knew he wasn't, and he owned up to it. And in that owning up to it, in that redemption, we see so often in Psalms, when he writes Psalms, we see that struggle of where he knows he has gone down here in the valley with stuff, and yet he finds that his relationship with God pulling him out of that, God's love for him pulling him out of that, and still equipping and enabling and empowering him to continue on with the mission of building God's kingdom. And again, David is not so far out of reach as we might think. His actions, we can be a David, we can be an Abraham, we can be these people because physically they're no different from us. It's just their faithfulness. And so my encouragement to you today is to look to them. And as we continue this next week, we'll see what God ultimately reveals in this person of Messiah, in this person of Jesus Christ. So I hope you have been blessed today. I hope you have been encouraged. And with that, we'll talk to you later. Bye.